Welcome back. Now, we talked about, in the last segment, we talked about how knowledge is power. And I hope that one of your takeaways is understanding why no one wants you to have this knowledge. Why the industry wants to keep you ignorant. Why the industry wants to keep you in an echo chamber where you're talking to people just like you who have an incomplete perspective of the industry. The more that the knowledge is over here and the artists are over here, the more the power and money can be kept over here and you kept over here. So obviously, if you think through that lens, gaining knowledge should be your first order of business to truly understand how to be successful as an independent artist. The next area of fundamentals would be understanding that the entire music industry is built around people and property. But the real secret here is it's about who controls the people and property and who doesn't. So I want to dig into this a little bit. And some of this, again, I don't expect that anybody watching these videos is going to look at it and say, oh my gosh, like I've never heard of that, Brock. Or, you know, of course, you teaching us, you know, basic like baby stuff for an indie artist. Every artist knows this or this. The problem is, one of the ways the industry keeps you at always at a disadvantage is making you believe that you know a lot because you know a little. I'll give you a couple of secrets, and now that you have a couple of secrets, if I look at the whole pie, you know less than 1%, but I've spread it out enough for you to feel like, oh my gosh, I know so much. This is a lifelong, career-long journey of learning. So we're going to jump into the next piece about people and property and who controls and who doesn't. So in order to do that, we need to understand that it's really about copyrights. In a lot of ways, it's about copyrights. We talk about sound recordings and masters, and we also talk about musical compositions, or sometimes songs or lyrics and melody, or lyrics and music, that sort of thing. So you hear a lot of different terminology around these things, but the properties, the main properties we're dealing with tend to be your sound recordings or masters over here, tracks. The hard part is you've heard different terms for the same thing. So you might have heard, hey, grab that track, grab that master, grab that sound recording. Technically speaking, under copyright law, it's called the sound recording, but it's the master side. The other is the underlying musical composition, the lyrics and melody. So that's over here. So if we start with understanding, we have these two pieces of property. And for many of you, you've just always kind of viewed it as almost like a creative expression rather than a legal or business understanding. So you write a song, you get out your guitar, your keyboard or whatever, and you just hit record. And of course, you know how to manipulate the recording, you know how to produce, you know how to come up with a track. But you've never truly viewed these as two pieces of property, which is critical to understanding how the music industry works and where the money's coming from and who controls that flow of money. Because if you don't understand that the musical composition is separate from the master and those two pieces of property travel independently or can travel together, then you're never really going to understand how the music industry works. So let's start there. I sit down on my keyboard, I sit down with my guitar and I start writing a song. Or I work with some other songwriters, we get in a room, we start working on a song, we have this song. And we're playing it, we're singing it, sounds great, we love it. Now we're going to record it. Okay, so we start with a musical composition. Then we record it. Now if it's, we say professionally produced or not professionally produced, it doesn't matter. Sound recording is a sound recording. And from a copyright perspective, we can get tangled up in, and there's going to be lawyers that, well, it has to be the best edition when you register a copyright. It's part of the road. There's a million rabbit trails we can take. I'm not going to go down every rabbit trail just because you've heard somebody speak on a certain topic and say, well, Brock, in order for copyright to attach, it's got to be the best edition. That's not true. Copyright attaches when you have a work of authorship, an original work of authorship, fixed in a tangible medium of expression. So if you record a song and it's acoustic, there's a copyright. But practically speaking, a lot of us will say, well, we don't treat it sort of as a copyright until we actually record it professionally with the producer and we mix and master that thing. And then we release that thing. Now we treat it as a copyright. But understanding that copyright can exist before you actually release it is very important to your understanding of knowledge of how the properties work. Because we do have something that could be protectable by copyright, but also that we can exploit. And it's not necessarily the finished product out here. And when I say finished, again, Don't hear me wrong. There's a difference between a half-written song, and there's a difference between an acoustic version and a fully produced version. So that's really what I'm kind of talking about right now. But think about this. We have a sound recording, so we've recorded our track, and let's say it's professionally produced just so we could kind of keep the thought process going. Who controls that? So right now we say, well, I'm an indie artist. I do. I have the control. But you've heard this, probably when you're a kid, if not to, just in other circumstances, but you can have 100% of this little pie, or you can get 15% of this huge pie. What's better? And that's where it gets really tense with indie artists in thinking that independent artists want to feel control, right? They want to feel ownership. They want to feel vested because it's sort of their baby. It's their creative baby that they've created. But they also feel power when they know they control. So if you control your masters, you feel powerful, right? But think about this. Just because you control them doesn't mean you know how to monetize them. Doesn't mean you know how to bring people to listen to them, right? And so that's why when we talk about the fundamentals of the indie music industry, or the music industry in general, really, and the properties, and we say who controls them and who doesn't, to say that independent artists don't control their music it's false, right? Independent artists, tons of them do, hundreds of thousands, millions, own their masters. But remember the triangle I talked about earlier of knowledge, power, money? What's missing in that component? What's missing in that little triangle diagram? Money. So having ownership doesn't necessarily equate to money. And maybe it's the knowledge is missing. And maybe that's another reason to go back and watch the first part again and say, is knowledge really that important? No, I know too much. Well, then why aren't you making money? Well, I have the power, but you don't have the money. So sometimes you can have the power, the control without the money. But you're in ultimate power when you have that control and you have the money and you have the knowledge. Again, going back to the first video, your label executives, your lawyers, your agents, your managers, those people have all three. They have the knowledge, the control, or the power, and the money. What do you have? Well, I have control, I have ownership. And this is where independent artists really, they truly don't understand the music industry. Because to them, part of the answer is, well, I control it. I own it. So now I'm in charge, I'm in power. But if that's the case, then the next big question is, well, then why aren't you making the money from it? Because that's not the full equation, right? So I'm trying to hit a point home because I feel like this is one of the reasons why so many independent artists struggle, is because their instinct is to say, I know how I do this. I don't need a record label. I can now make music with my computer and my instruments, and I got, people around me, other creatives. We can put this all together. We got aggregators, we got distribution. We don't need a label. We don't need a publisher. But my question is, you control it, but where's the money? Because when I look at the publishers and I look at the record labels, and certainly the majors, and I say, forget what you read in the news. There's money being made, right? And so who has that money? Well, it's people with the control. What do they have control of? Well, they may not have control of your music, but that's because you're an independent artist. And so I know this could really quickly become offensive, and it's like, what, is that a bad thing? No, I'm an advocate for the independent artist community. My point is to equip yourselves with the knowledge that's going to help you be successful. So starting with, we have two pieces of property. Who owns and controls them, and who doesn't? When I say I give up my ownership or I give up my control to a record label, that somehow that puts me at a disadvantage. I'm no longer independent. Well, sure, maybe by definition that is true. You're technically no longer independent when you're signed to a record label. It's debatable. But the other piece of that is, but what if that's the smartest move for you to become successful? Because at the end of the day, part of what I want to challenge you with is it your goal to be an independent artist, or is it your goal to be a successful artist? Because I think we get caught up in this whole idea of independent artist is really what it's about. But if we peel it back, what does that mean exactly? It means we have a little bit more control, or maybe a lot of control, but we also make the money. We're also happy doing what we're doing. We're able to make a lot of music and do shows and all the things that we want to do. So is it really about the title independent artist? Is it really about not signing to a label? For some artists, absolutely yes. But I think even if we targeted them, those artists that are like, absolutely yes, I have to be independent, I will never sign to a label. If you interview them, chances are it's because they've been damaged by a label. Number one, they've been damaged by a label or label relationship, or they've heard a war story and been damaged by the story that didn't even happen to them. The rest of us as independent artists that say, I want to be an independent artist, it's not because we have this drive to be outside the fold. We want to create. We want control. We want power. We want influence. We want to be able to make a sound and people care about it. And we want to make money in the process. So the independent music roadmap doesn't necessarily always land in the arena of never being signed. And that is another fundamental of this industry that we have to understand. Your end goal shouldn't be to always remain away from the fold, away from the mass. Because part of how you get momentum on your songs, you already know this, you need fans, you need a lot of people showing up. Well, what happens in the industry when people get excited about an artist? There's more offers on the table. The offers tend to be better, right? And so it's not so much that we want to stay away and isolate and say, we're not a part of the industry, we're independent, we're over here. I don't think that's the goal of the average independent artist. I don't think that's the goal of an independent artist that wants to be successful. I think an independent artist that wants to be successful says, I want to make music, I want to have control, I want to have power, I want to have influence, and I want to make money. What if you're 3 steps away from getting signed to a major record label or a major publisher or doing some sort of distribution deal or something, and that is the answer? And ironically, the very thing that sort of gives you that indie edge is the thing that comes with partnerships or collaborations. And I'm not saying that works for everybody, but I'm saying that what is really hard for me in working so much with indie artists is that we tend to get into this echo chamber where it's all about us versus them. And my challenge to you in that is it really us versus them? Or is that really secretly what the vast majority of indie artists are trying to break into? And we just need a pathway. But until we get there, we want to say we're independent. But do we want to be broke? Do we want to be powerless? Do we want to not have any fans? Absolutely not. We want to make enormous amounts of money. We want to know that we're getting millions of streams. We want to know that we can sell out arenas with our shows. Well, then maybe, quote, indie is more about ideology and thinking than it is not signing deals. So the more educated you are in how this works, the smarter you can be in adapting to maybe it's not a traditional record deal. Maybe it's a label services deal. Maybe you only need help with blank or fill in the blank with what you need help with. So there's a lot of options, but it starts with the properties. Well, typically, so let's take another trail on this. That you have your sound recording, your master over here, and your musical composition over here. Who normally deals with this? Well, again, if you're an independent artist, it's you, right? You are the label, the publisher, the marketer. You're all of it, right? But understanding the industry, you have to understand that record labels work with masters and sound recordings. Record labels, producers work with the sound recording. Publishers work with musical compositions. Publishers aren't working with the masters. They're acquiring the musical compositions and then exploiting those for money. And that might be with partnering with their affiliated label or pitching it to another artist at another label, whatever. There's a million ways to make money off of songs. The point is understanding publishers are over here with the musical composition, along with songwriters. One confusing question I get really frequently that's kind of confusing is like, where do producers land? Because they kind of seem like they're on the sound recording side, but a lot of times it seems like they're also on the songwriter side. Simple answer is sometimes producers put on a songwriter hat. So if you start to see people in terms of the properties they're interacting with, then you could see that we have a producer that's working on the track, but in the process of working on the track says, you know what, I really think this line would be better, this hook would be better if we change these words. Now they're songwriting. And pro tip here, I'll insert real quick, is that if there's songwriting, there's probably going to be an expectation around songwriting credit and splits, and you have to deal with that whole thing. So if you are working on a track with a producer, just for your own knowledge, you should know going in, there's a possibility that your producers, while working on the track, will have input on the song, the musical composition. And when that happens, they may have an expectation of a songwriting credit or some sort of split, publishing or otherwise. And when they do, if you're not going into that with the mindset of understanding that might happen, you're not going to be prepared when the track's finished. I've seen this happen, I can't even count, so many times over the years to indie artists. They work with a producer, they pay a flat rate, they've agreed on, whatever, 3 points on the back end. And then they walk out of that room and the track is amazing. And the producer sends them a split sheet and it says, hey, I'm a 10% writer. And the indie artist is like, what? No, you're a producer. Like, I have a contract. Well, the producer's going to say, but I also influenced the writing on that project. We changed some lines. Aren't those my words? So that little piece of the pro tip is also how to avoid some disputes by preparing for them in advance. And that's a common scenario with indie artists working with producers, is that a lot of times those producers will get involved in the writing process. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm saying you need to understand what's happening. And if you're aware and you have knowledge of what's happening, you can influence the process. So back on the main track, we labels, producers, artists are all over, and musicians are all over here on the sort of the master side, sound recording side, and then publishers, songwriters, and administrators or publishing administrators are over here on the musical composition side. But you also see, well, what about like a film and TV, like a sync licensing agency? Well, typically when we say synchronization, we're talking about musical composition. So they might be pitching the musical composition for film and TV, but it's likely that they're also pitching an associated master with it. So some agencies are actually interacting with both pieces of property at the same time. Some aren't, some are. So it's more for you just to become aware with that. But also the key is you can start to just drop in the names. Well, we have, what about concert promoters? Well, they're dealing with live performances. So are they really either of those properties? No. But remember earlier when I started this little segment, I said it's about people and properties, or properties and people. People, if you're talking about a tour promoter, you're talking about a road manager or whatever, if you wanted to sort of silo where those people fit, is it the master, sound recording, or the musical composition? In the case of a road manager, for example, it's about the person. Who's the person? The artist. So a songwriter takes a different role than an artist. And if you're all those things, if you're the independent artist that produces your own, writes, produces, and records and performs all of your own stuff, you're wearing all those hats. But understand, the music business has separate hats for each of those people. So even if you are that one person, when you're songwriting, get in the habit of putting on the songwriter hat. When you're thinking about the musical composition, put on a publisher hat, music publisher hat. The reason why this is critical is because then you start to think through the lens of how best to protect, control, and exploit this piece of property. You can monetize much better when you're wearing a publisher hat. You can monetize a musical composition, rather. Much better when you're wearing a music publisher hat than you can with a label hat, simply because it's almost like native apps. Let me take a quick detour just to create an analogy for you to understand this. A lot of people will create YouTube videos and say, well, I'll strip out the audio and put that onto a podcast. But think about it. When you're speaking to a camera, you're speaking very differently than you would if you're just speaking into a microphone. And even the edits are going to be different. So when we say like YouTube content is native, meaning we filmed it and it was meant for YouTube, it's not native when we take that same content and put it on a podcast. That wasn't where it was born, right? That wasn't where it was intended. Music is a little bit of the same concept, where if we think about the musical composition as an artist, that's a non-native environment, meaning the artist has a certain lens and perspective, just like labels have a certain lens and perspective. Producers have a certain lens and perspective. Let's say looking over this way and how best to protect, control, and exploit this property. A songwriter or publisher is going to have a different lens. But if you're the indie artist and you're like, well, Brock, I'm the same person. What are you talking about? Switching your hat just means changing your perceptions and the way that you think about this a little bit differently. Because the way you exploit a musical composition is not the same as the way you exploit a master. There's a lot of different tools. There's a lot of different methodologies for exploiting one property over the other. So that's a big piece of what you need to think about. So at the end of the day, this segment we're going to wrap up with, you need to understand that the music business is really about people and property. But the real secret is about who controls it. And I want you thinking about, do you need to control it? Is it important for you to control it? But not only that, what happens if you do control it? Is that the right choice for you? Does that make you the most money? Does that give you the most impact? Does that give you the most listeners or streams or views? That's really what I want you thinking about. So we're going to jump into the next fundamental, but take another break. If you haven't liked or subscribed, I hope this has been helpful for you. Like and subscribe. There's a ton of content here to help the independent artist. That's who I care about. So now we're going to jump topics into the next fundamental.